There's many different types of plastic. We're going to talk a little bit about those types of plastic and why they differ, how they differ, and how they kind of characterize different types of microplastics. You've seen this before. It's a rough outline of the types of plastics that are kind of out there and the numbers they have on them. Some plastics are strong and sturdy. Other plastics are weaker and more brittle. Some are transparent. Some are not transparent. Some are easy to bend. Some are more difficult to bend. These different characteristics of plastics are really why we characterize them differently for the sake of recycling and for the sake of health, and what plastics can be used for products that are in contact with sick patients in a hospital or babies or food packaging versus plastics that are used for more general cases like your laptop or a cushion or article of clothing. Single-use plastics, like the plastics you see for beverages, bottled water, are the single most commonly found plastic in our environment. They represent about 14% of all plastic pollution. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit more to microplastics. So we talked about plastics in general. There's a lot of them. They keep growing. They're all around the world. Microplastics come in two main categories. The first is primary microplastics. These are the ones we create and add to our environment on purpose. These are things like plastics found in cosmetics or abrasives, and they're intentionally manufactured because they're small and because they can perform something very reliably. Like in the last 20 years or so, there's been this big growth in these kind of scrubs for skincare. A lot of those had plastic beads in them. That's what a primary microplastic is. We're making the microplastic. Then there's secondary microplastics, which I think is what most people will think of most naturally when you think of microplastics. These are the microplastics that emerge from the breakdown of other plastics. So when you think about a bag floating tragically in the ocean and it breaking down very slowly over time and forming more pollution as a result of that degradation, those tiny microplastic fragments are secondary microplastics. Now I'm going to transfer a little bit of our attention towards that kind of discussion of plastic breaking down in the environment. There are kind of three principal pathways by which these microplastics are formed in the environment. These secondary microplastics are formed in the environment. So again, that proverbial tragic plastic bag floating in the ocean. There are physical processes like photodegradation, where exposure to sunlight, particularly UV radiation, will break down a plastic into smaller pieces over time. This is probably one of the most common ways that microplastics degrade. You're essentially just breaking the polymer chains apart using that UV, the power in the UV from the sun. Second most common way you're forming microplastics in the environment is mechanical. So if you visit a construction site or a factory, pretty much any time of day, any day of year around the world, there's somebody cutting pipe or somebody breaking some form of plastic. And when that happens, just like the plastic bottled water, when we said, hey, when you open that top of the plastic water bottle, you're releasing microplastics into the water because of that fissure. It's that mechanical process, that physical abrasion, that creates the largest number of what will turn out to be, as you'll see, the most common type of microplastic, which are the very, very small microplastics. So construction sites and other industrial activity, by virtue of doing a lot of manipulation of plastics, a lot of cutting of plastics, are creating a ton of microplastic downstream. Usually it's getting washed away either by the air or by water. And then finally, you have chemical processes for the formation of microplastics. Oxygen is a highly reactive element. It's obviously ubiquitous in our environment, and combining oxygen with water and UV, it's really just a reaction soup for the creation of microplastics and other degradation byproducts of the plastics in our environment. So as I said, different types of microplastics. We talked about the types of microplastics, namely the types of plastic 1 through 7. You also have the size of microplastics, and it turns out that the size of the microplastic matters a great deal. There's been a lot of conversation in the last few years about microplastics, and I remember myself saying like, oh, you know, microplastics don't seem to be a big health concern just a few years ago. And a lot of that was because research, which is still evolving rapidly in this field of microplastics, had principally looked at these larger microplastics. So on the right side of your screen, you see the 5,000 micrometer, 5 millimeter, and 8 micron size microplastics, which are to scale on the screen. These effectively pass relatively well through our environment and through our human organs, and are not known to be as much of a concern, at least not at this point in time. Smaller microplastics have two kind of more nefarious qualities. So as you get below 5 microns, and I'll say this about 80% of all plastics, microplastics that were detected in those tap water samples, are those smaller microplastics to the left of that red blood cell. So very small formations. You can kind of see them with the naked eye up until about somewhere between that red blood cell and the big purple microplastic on the right-hand side. Everything to the left, you need some kind of microscopy to really see properly. This is where most of the microplastics live, this size range. And at the very far left, you have the nanoplastics. So they're at the nano scale. The problem with these smaller microplastics, and the reason we call them out with extra attention, is that not only does their size mean that they are often in greater numbers, it's that their size makes them eligible to interfere with more processes. So we'll see that because they're very small, they're able to really harm organisms in the environment, especially smaller organisms that are more sensitive to things like tiny microplastics. Even in the human ecosystem, inside of our own bodies, these smaller microplastics are eligible to get caught up in processes or get caught up in parts of our body that they shouldn't be. And it is that size of the microplastic that turns out to be a very simple but very important descriptor of microplastics. And I'll pass it on here to Jess, who is more qualified than I to talk about some of the latest research on microplastics and health.
So, as Johnny was kind of alluding to, microplastics have actually been identified in human organs, placenta, blood, lungs, feces, and throughout our bloodstream, which is pretty unfortunate. And the question really is like, what is the effect of these exposures on human systems? So the main three pathways that we think microplastics and nanoplastics have an impact on health are risks from, one, the physical hazards of ingesting and inhaling these tiny particles. So effects that occur as a result of the physical object itself accumulating in an organ or, transferring into a placenta, for example. And the other two pathways are a little bit different. It's about the release of either toxic chemicals that plastics are made with that are basically transported by microplastics, or the release of pollutants and pathogens that stick to the surface of microplastics. So in that first category, we're talking about what is the effect of the microplastic itself, but the second two categories of potential risk emerge from chemicals, pathogens that are actually attached to or part of the microplastic. And this makes microplastics really unique because usually in toxicology, we're thinking about what is the impact of this one type of chemical, one contaminant, whereas with microplastics, it's a huge and diverse array. Just as a reference point, something like 10,000 unique chemicals are used in the production of plastics. Some over 2,400 of those are chemicals of concern that might actually have an effect. None of that has been deeply researched in microplastics, but this is why they are so challenging to study and really even understand health effects to begin with. In alignment with EPA and WHO, the concept right now is that the evidence for health effects is rather weak, but that doesn't mean that it is wrong or incorrect. It's just that the ability to even measure and study these microplastics in the environment and on health has been limited by analytical issues and our just understanding of the extent of the problem. Typically, when we're thinking about what is evidence for a health effect, we think about three sort of primary modes of evidence. There's others as well, but one is understanding if there's health effects that are seen in animal studies. So the unfortunate subjugation of rodents and fish in laboratories to exposures, and then we kind of identify, does the exposure have an impact on this organ system? Another area of evidence is sometimes epidemiological studies, which say, hey, I'm looking at this huge population of people, and I do some statistical analyses to look at associations between certain health outcomes and exposures in some groups of people versus others. And probably the gold standard of evidence is the observational study of effects of contaminants on humans themselves. Many people get a lot of evidence about health effects from occupational exposures where people are exposed to high levels of chemicals and contaminants. And based on all three of these types of evidence, almost all of the information we have about micro or nanoplastics is on animal models. So that tells us a lot, but it doesn't give us a lot of confidence in our ability to say this is an effect on humans. So I think that's a really important caveat before thinking about potential risks. So of the large list of things here, almost everything is evidence from animal models. The thoughts about the kind of like physical hazards of ingestion relate to the potential effect of inflammation at like the sites of microplastics accumulation. There's been evidence in aquatic species about oxidative stress being caused by microplastic exposure, influences on the immune system and neurology, as well as metabolic effects. And one of the very interesting, more recent studies that is, I think, to my knowledge, at least the only observational study in humans was a study that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at people at risk for cardiovascular disease. And the group of folks that had microplastics in their carotid arteries were much more likely to die of cardiovascular disease compared to the control group, even though both groups were being treated. So that it was a very, took headlines because I think it's one of the first cases where we're saying we can see this contaminant in our bodies, in our organs, and we're seeing potential effects there. Obviously, one study is one study. We really need a lot more research in this area. Other ones of these, like endocrine effects and reproductive effects, genotoxicity, which is basically DNA damage, could fall under the category of influence from the microplastics themselves, but also from those chemicals that plastics are made from. So as I mentioned, thousands of chemicals are used in the production of plastics, pigments, plasticizers. Many of these fall under the category of what we know as endocrine disruptors, and so they influence your endocrine system. And so these are just really large concerns that we need more exploration within microplastics and nanoplastics research. Part of the reason for so much caveating about we don't totally know, we're not sure, there's some evidence here, some evidence there, this is painting a picture of concern, but not one where we can directly identify how to even identify what's going on in the environment. A lot of that has to do with the fact that methods for even identifying, especially these very small like nanoplastics, are still rapidly evolving. So I'm going to talk briefly about testing for microplastics, and I'm going to focus specifically on drinking water because we're TAPSCORE, and of course that's our main focus area today. So typically when we're looking at what available methods exist to test and measure a contaminant in the environment, we're looking to the regulatory environment because often this is where we get certified, validated methods that drive how regulatory agencies evaluate these things in the environment, and that tends to become the gold standard. Right now, California is actually the only government in the world to require monitoring for microplastics in drinking water. It's extremely ahead of the curve in this regard, and as a result, they've compiled a standard set of documents to try and validate different methods and propose best practices. There is still no specific laboratory that is accredited for these methods because this is all happening real time right now. And on the flip side of that, the experimental and residential testing, people's interest in, is this in my drinking water, I want to understand now, is really an emerging interest alongside these regulatory processes. So that has an implication for what methods are even available at commercial labs for people to use and how quickly they're changing. Interestingly, when I say the word method, maybe you think about one specific instrument measuring something, but actually there's not really one specific method that's the gold standard for microplastics testing, even though some are high contenders. And typically what labs are doing when they're experimenting and trying to develop methods, especially for something as complex as this, where you have different sizes, size categories that you're looking at, different materials that you're trying to identify. We need to see multiple methods for any one given sample. And we understand methods for microplastics is kind of falling into two categories. One is the category methods that actually allows you to count how many microplastics are there at these different size categories that exist. And the other is to identify, well, what is the composition of that microplastic? What is the polymer that you're actually looking at? Is it PVC? Is it PET? And so both of those have really different analytical methods that go into them. So at TAPSCORE right now, we're kind of really trying to stay on top as on top of the methods available as we can. We hope that this offering evolves with the science and with labs increasingly seeing the relevance of offering these services. And with our current capacity, our offering focuses on both count methods and polymer identification. So we have optical microscopy and polarized light microscopy who support the counting of microplastics. And optical microscopy is quite literally filtering a sample, putting that sample underneath a microscope, and then someone visually inspecting and counting with the magnification of the microscope. There are also software methods that do that. Polarized light microscopy helps basically create a greater contrast for transparent microplastics, which are harder to count. So that helps increase the ability of someone able to detect and see and differentiate, because there are a lot of other smaller things floating around in drinking water samples. And finally, Raman spectroscopy is used to identify the polymers that are actually in that the sample is made of. So right now we offer two tests, the microplastic water test, which basically is a count method, and the advanced, which is the count method plus the identification of these polymers. We're in regular contact with the labs to try and understand how the methods are evolving, and hope to continue to expand these offerings as we learn more and identify, more folks out there that are onboarding these emerging kind of experimental methods. And with that, you're slightly concerned and now curious about how you could actually deal with this. So if you were to identify microplastics in your drinking water, what would you do about it?
There are kind of three principal means for removing microplastics. I'll say as a rule of thumb, in principle, that removing microplastics should be pretty straightforward with available technologies. I'll also say that there's not been a lot of close research into the filtration or treatment and removal of microplastics, so it's early days. First and foremost, reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis systems are going to be highly effective at removing almost all particles at the molecular level and above. That means on that graph we looked at, or that chart we looked at with microplastics earlier, just about all microplastics are going to be excluded effectively from a reverse osmosis filtration system. That being said, a lot of people don't want to buy and own and maintain a reverse osmosis system, so you might be wondering what other options are out there. Put simply, microfiltration, ultrafiltration, and nanofiltration are three options for non-RO membranes that will work effectively at increasing rates of efficacy. So microfiltration, probably not your best bet. It's going to let through a lot of the smaller, nano-sized and tiny micro-sized microplastics. Ultrafilters will be better, and nanofilters will be best. As far as activated carbon, something very kind of ubiquitous in the marketplace for home and commercial water filtration, it's hard to say with the rule of thumb how effective or ineffective activated carbon filtration is going to be for microplastics. And because it depends largely not just on the microplastics and the size of the microplastics, but also greatly because different activated carbon systems have different amounts of carbon surface area, and that component ends up being a very important dimension to the effectiveness of a particular activated carbon filter. There is a filtration accreditation for microplastics. It's kind of in the very kind of beginning. I think it emerged in the last couple of years. The NSF certification 401. So it specifically claims that a product with this certification can remove 80% of all microplastics that are challenged to that system between the 1 and 5 micrometer size. There are a lot of these polypropylene plastic filters on the market. Most of the brands are made of plastic, not all of them. The ones that are made of plastic have aroused some suspicion or some question about whether or not they are leaching microplastics themselves into the water that they're supposed to be filtering. Unfortunately, like so many answers to so many of these questions, we still don't really know if this is a big concern. We don't think it is. Fortunately, most of these filters are made of plastic number 5, which is polypropylene. This is like the second or third most widely produced plastic on Earth. It is light, it is heat resistant, it's sturdy, it's applied in various forms of packaging because of these reasons. And unless you're banging this filter around the kitchen or rubbing sandpaper on it or leaving it out in the sun on the car seat or all sorts of things you shouldn't normally be doing with a water filter, you're generally not going to be creating a lot of microplastics through the use of these devices. Now, just couch that one more time. I haven't seen a lot of research, and we looked into what kinds of microplastics may or may not be formed by these filtration units that are made of plastic. There was a very popular study not long ago, about 2 or 3 months now, that showed boiling water could remove microplastics. Long story short, it kind of created a lot of confusion because I don't think it's a very practical means for anyone to be removing microplastics. Boiling water raises the pH of the water and reduces the solubility of the calcium carbonate, the water hardness that's in the water. As a result of reducing that solubility and raising the pH, that calcium carbonate, the carbonate is going to precipitate out, so it's going to fall out of solution. And as it does that, it will capture microplastics on the way out. This is a well-known phenomenon. Probably my favorite part of the story is that these precipitates are called encrustants, and that has no relevance to microplastics other than to know that encrustants are the precipitate of carbonate that grabs microplastics when they fall out of solution.
All right, thanks, Johnny and Jess. Just to summarize, we've discussed where we find microplastics, how they're created, the health effects of microplastics, testing for microplastics in drinking water, and ways of filtering microplastics out of drinking water. Of course, this is such a new concern that we're still learning about. There's a lot more to say. So if you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear them now that you've heard our entire presentation. The first one is from Andrew, and he's asking, what are the best filtering techniques for microplastics, and which grade of microplastics do they target?
Yes, I think the simplest way to reduce microplastics technically is with reverse osmosis. It'll work almost every time, and it'll work for all types of microplastics. That being said, RO has its own drawbacks. It wastes a lot of water. It's kind of expensive and complicated to maintain. A lot of people don't like the taste of reverse osmosis water because it is so demineralized. But if you had to kind of label one the silver bullet, and of course we're always very cautious about ever saying that about any treatment technology, when it comes to microplastics, it would probably be reverse osmosis.
Next question, where in the system do the utilities test their water for microplastics?
Right now, since this is not regularly monitored by most utilities, you're not going to get that. But in California, where this is becoming a requirement, my understanding is that it's basically in line at the plant. So they're not necessarily measuring similar to lead or disinfection byproducts further down in the distribution system. I'd have to confirm, but one of the larger topics about microplastics is how much sampling volume. And so one thought is basically at the plant, you can get pretty large samples from the utility directly that way.
Can the body eliminate them? How?
I think this is an interesting question because with most things that we consume, we do have a a pretty good elimination process, and the body is good at removing things. And with microplastics, Johnny mentioned earlier that the size really matters. And so it's likely that we excrete a fair amount of microplastics that are in our food that go through the intestinal tract. But the smaller the microplastics are, the easier it is for them to get into tissues and the bloodstream. And so it's really, and if you inhale them and they go into your lungs and your bloodstream, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to excrete them. And unfortunately, one of the characteristics that makes plastics so useful is that it basically doesn't break down on its own without, other processes going on. So it's not something that I would rely on my body to properly eliminate. I'd rather avoid consuming them in the first place.
Last question we have here. Are there any requirements for EPA testing of water supplies?
Don't believe yet from the EPA. I think California as a state has begun monitoring microplastics in water utilities as a initial measure, and I think it's the first such measure in the United States. But it's a well-known phenomenon in environmental regulatory history for the United States that California tends to lead the charge on a lot of these types of monitoring and regulation programs. So I would not be surprised if we see other states and eventually perhaps the federal government passing some kind of, or at least commenting more broadly on microplastics in the coming years. It's worth noting that today, I think, is a huge day for PFAS at the EPA. So they have their hands busy with per and polyfluoroalkyl substances and the new MCLs for PFAS. Obviously, PFAS are not microplastics, but they are very closely related in many ways. I won't go down that road here and now, but I don't know, Jess, if you want to add anything else to that regarding EPA monitoring or testing for or regulating microplastics.
Yeah, so far there's no regulation or monitoring requirements. They have put together expert working groups to try and evaluate the potential health concerns, which is usually a starting point for getting something on a contaminant list. I'll also note that, and similar to PFAS, one thing we didn't fully dive into is the fact that the exposure route through drinking water is maybe about 20% of total exposures. So probably as far as regulations go, it would be great to have regulations in drinking water, but also for other ways that they get into the environment.